Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Body of Evidence. So, really, there might be some skirting around that I'm going to do while I'm going to be reviewing this movie because there is quite a bit of sex scenes that I cannot actually go into thorough detail and describe. Otherwise, I will be hit with something on YouTube. That's the great thing about YouTube. Really, you just have to kind of just say, yeah, well, I wanted to cover this movie, but also I realized what also entails in this movie as well. There are several times within this movie we are to see sex scenes that go really risque and really over the top, to the point of introducing candles and also introducing handcuffs and belts and all kinds of things within this movie. Like, this is like 50 Shades of Grey before 50 Shades of Grey was a thing within our lives. So, what does this movie entail? So, in a very cryptic sense, but I have to tee it up for a lot of people that have never heard of this movie before. This movie is about a guy who is found dead. We are naturally to assume that his wife was the one who was to kill him somehow, because it seems that he was found in his bedroom, and it also seems that there was evidence of some very over the top sex going on, even to the point of it seemingly uh, there being even a tape of their activities, because they evidently tape themselves. So it seems that we have a lawyer called Frank, who is, of course, played by Willem Dafoe, who is to kind of naturally assume that this case is not going to go to trial, that really there isn't enough hard evidence to really convict Rebecca, who is Madonna in this movie, of any wrongdoings, but eventually there is a trial about this, and eventually we have to pretty much air out all of Rebecca's dirty laundry and eventually find out that her past does try to almost come back to haunt her in this film. Uh, but we also eventually have Frank, who is, while this whole case is to go on, it seems that Frank is starting to, I guess, get a little too hot under the collar. While this case is to go on, finding out about Rebecca and her seemingly very dark and scary-ish like escapades, which is to basically have Frank and Rebecca's interactions with one another, have Frank getting a little too hot under the collar to where he is seemingly having an affair with his own client. And so that is what happens within a bulk of this movie. And so eventually we end up having Frank becoming so blind and he is just believing every single thing that Rebecca is feeding him, that eventually Frank gets such a good defense to go against his other lawyer in this case, that eventually we don't know at the end of this movie if anything was really and all true, or Rebecca was really really kind of saving her hide the whole entire time, realizing that she knew how to work a jury, work this court system, and whichever, to kind of sway all of this and have people buy into it. So, really, we're going to find out the entire time if eventually Rebecca, at the end of this, gets convicted for this murder or not. Really, Frank really goes and tells Rebecca that it's like, well, all they need is reasonable doubt. If it seems like there could be some other person with a motive to take Andrew out, then it could be obvious that Rebecca may not have been the actual culprit to all this. And plus, also, we have Frank who is buying into every single thing that Rebecca is saying. And so, kind of makes for a very interesting film. Kind of makes for also a fairly interesting ending. But I like the fact eventually where Frank is really starting to realize that he is really uh, feeling like he is just one of Rebecca's men. And eventually he is to uh, start to get really just upset about this once he is to try and have to ask questions or have another lawyer ask questions to a number of people, a number of uh, people that are going to come in that are involved or that were at a point in time involved with Rebecca. An interesting film. At the end of the day, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this film in a very cryptic like sense. Uh, Really, I thought that this movie could appeal to people, and you could probably figure out why, but justifiably. Like, to have Madonna in this film and have William Dafoe in this film, and to have this film play out the way it does, I was just kind of fascinated by this film. To where I had eventually, I had reviewed this previously some time ago, but then I'm like, you know what? Like, out of all the movies that I had to review at some point, and then now I'm coming over here and trying to like do something that at least seems at some point a little bit different, but a little bit of the same. This movie kind of stuck out to me as just a movie where it kind of felt like this movie really stuck out. It's more than just the sex scenes. And so, with that said, I think it's about that time to go into spoiler time about this film. So, let's go out of our way to say that we have seen this film. If you want to go and check it out on Tubi, otherwise, go ahead and hear what I have to say in spoiler variation, which again, like I said, I'm probably gonna have to skirt around a lot of things just because uh, I wanted to talk about this movie again, but I did like I'm gonna have to really just kind of tail back a lot of things, just because I forcibly have to, because the way of YouTube does things. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we go on, and the very beginning of this movie is we are to see a man dead in his bed. It seems that he is to have been spotted by a girl named Joan. And so we are to have Joan call the police, and the police is to come and uh, uh, look over the dead body. And it seems that there is a bunch of there's a video of both Rebecca and Andrew in the passions of love and the throes of passion, whichever, on a video to where we have, of course, Robert Garrett, who is mentioning, like, yeah, like good quality. It's like, yeah, like, yeah, good quality video, I guess. So we go on to have Robert, who's a little confused of why he's even here, and because this guy had just like killed over, maybe off of some kind of fixation of sorts or whichever. But it seems that they are to have had a eyewitness of Joan that was to make the statement that Rebecca had killed Andrew. It also seems that Andrew, after this, had seemingly gotten some kind of dose of cocaine, and it seems that that amount of cocaine was a lethal dose of cocaine, and we'll find that out later on. So we go on, and uh, we are to have also like this. We are to have like both Robert and all the detectives kind of looking around and seeing that there are clamps of sorts for certain kind of activities. There's a bunch of just some kind of toys and all kinds of things, like kind of all over the place. And so it also seemed that there was some kind of scratching marks on their bedpost or their bed thing to kind of showcase that someone had been handcuffed previously. And also, it seemed that uh, Andrew had like some kind of marks on his body that they couldn't really quite understand exactly from. So going on to this movie, they just naturally assumed that more than likely it would have been the spouse who was to uh, force force Andrew in such a extreme like SEX act, which created his heart attack, which was to have him die. So we have Rebecca, who is to be at Andrew's funeral, and Rebecca is kind of feeling that she is outcast or shunned for even showing up at Andrew's funeral. It's like, well, she was his wife, and like there is not a real true evidence that says 100% that she was the killer. So we have Willem Dafoe, who's Frank, that arrives to Rebecca, and Rebecca is like, well, I guess I should hire you, Frank, because I think that I'm going to need an attorney to fight this case, because really, I guess everyone is assuming that I'm a killer, so I guess I have to go and uh, like put plans into place. And we have it to where Frank is like, I don't even think that this is even going to come to trial. Like, there is no clear evidence that even says that you were the culprit in all this. There's no smoking gun. There's nothing. Like, so we eventually have this come to trial regardless, and so it seems that we have we have uh, Rebecca as seemingly to be a person that could have quite possibly murdered Andrew, and so they go on to trial. So we are to go on and have Robert in his opening statement mention that uh, that if Robert were to take his hand and make a fist and punch someone in the face, and immediately after that person was punched in the face, that person was to die, then quite possibly Robert could be considered a weapon, and that I guess is the smoking gun in this case. That I guess Rebecca was much younger than Andrew, and then she had the ability to push him to the breaking point of course keeling over, of having a heart attack and dying in this situation. And so we have Rebecca, or we have also uh, Frank, who ends up going and having his opening statement, and there wasn't anything creative that he delivered in his opening statement. He's just like, yeah, like there's not even a reason for Rebecca to even be here. It's like there isn't enough evidence to really truly have her here, and we're also going to try to prove without a reasonable doubt that like she isn't the killer here. So we push on and go on to this trial. And so all Rebecca needs is a reasonable doubt to think that somebody else could have quite possibly killed uh, killed Andrew besides Rebecca. So we end up having of course, the person that had found Andrew, Joan, come up first. So we have the sworn statement of that Rebecca had taken some drugs, and evidently that isn't actually true. Rebecca is to take Frank to a like herbal specialist, and it seems that that's what she would actually do, not actually cocaine or drugs or anything like that. Like she would take like herbs and spices and just like and try to medicate through that, bizarrely. Like she had some like voodoo doctor-ish like person like give her some kind of uh, things to be able to help her with her issues, her problems, and whatever. So we have Joan, who is to eventually be examined by Frank, and after like Joan mentions that it was obvious that Rebecca was the killer of Andrew, and how many numerous times that they left all kinds of toys all over the home for her to eventually come in and find and whatever. It seems that Joan was on a mission to push Andrew to the farthest depths of whatever, and Rebecca knew all good and well um, how much she could push Andrew. And so we also have it to where Robert kind of makes the point of that Rebecca knew all good and well that she was uh, the sole beneficiary of Andrew's will. It seems that Rebecca didn't even realize that, and Frank had to tell her that or that Rebecca was going to get $8 million after Andrew was to die. Rebecca didn't even realize this, and I think Frank was just kind of like, she didn't even know. Like, wow, that's kind of interesting. That's a way that I can kind of um, use this against Joan. So we have Frank who ends up going in and talking to Joan as examination. And so we have Frank who says to Joan, it's like, well, yeah, it seems that Joan, you and Andrew were really close. It seems that at some point Andrew was going to give his full will and whatever to you. And like that could have been a really good payout for you, but it seems that instead he ended up giving it to Rebecca. Like, wouldn't that give you motive to go and kill not only Andrew, but then also try to point out that Rebecca had killed him so she can go into jail forever so you could get this money? And Joan is like, well, no, like, if anything, like, I was more than happy to get whatever that I could from his will and testament. Like, for him to even think of me in putting anything into this will and testament, I was eternally grateful for. And Frank was like, sure, sure. So we go on, and so eventually we have Frank, who is eventually going to build much more of a case onto Joan, but like that's kind of all of what they kind of do with Joan. So we push on, and so we are to have eventually Robert and Frank having to examine, I think, some doctor of sorts that is to uh, who is to just kind of speculate a lot of things, to where Frank has to like object a lot or try to say like, yeah, this guy is speculating a lot. We have, God, what is his name? Uh, Doctor McCurdy, who ends up doing a lot of just speculating, and Frank has to object a lot because this doctor is like no, this is like this doctor is not actually like a psychologist. He's just a regular doctor. Like he doesn't know exactly uh, what had gone on to any part of this case. To eventually, the more that this doctor tries to speculate, the more Frank just kind of tears into him. So we also have we also have yet another doctor that is going to come into the fray of this, uh, which is Dr. Alan Paley. So we have Robert, who is of course doing his examination with Dr. Alan Paley, and so we have the doctor who is mentioning how really that Andrew had a number of conditions that really kind of pushed Andrew to the breaking point of if he were to go and seemingly take any kind of drug, something even as strong as cocaine, it would be basically like going into a uh, game of Russian roulette, where it's basically putting a gun to your head and hoping that the chamber that you squeeze is empty, or you be dead. So we have this doctor explaining how poor a condition that Andrew was in, and so we end up having eventually Frank, when he does his cross examination, is to tell the doctor, it's like, well, like, you know what, like, I don't think that you are probably like the best doctor to have us uh to have us like be here. And because it seems that this doctor was actually Andrew's regular physician, and we end up having the doctor who had looked through previous notes of stuff that he had kind of noted with Andrew and stuff like that to make sure that he has all the right things and stuff like that for this case. And so we end up having Frank, who is to mention, it's like, well, didn't you seem to have some kind of like attraction to Rebecca? Frank is mentioning this. Like, isn't it to the point to where uh, we have answering machine messages having you, I guess, seemingly at some point almost stalking Rebecca, and also like threatening Rebecca at some point. And so they are to have the answering machine recordings as evidence. And so Robert is like, wait a minute, like this is not like this could not exactly be this doctor's voice. And Frank says, no, we have confirmed it. If anything, like I have papers confirming that this is this guy's voice, and it's all sealed. So we end up having that being all correct. So they play the tapes, and it's the doctor mentioning that he wants to speak to Rebecca, and then the next tape recording is basically the doctor telling Rebecca that one way or another she's going to get effed. And so we have it to a reasonably, that is, I guess, is good enough considered a threat as of anything. So we are to push on uh, to with this case going the way it does. Let me pause here for a second. Okay. So we push on in this case. So we immediately have it to where it seems Frank is consistently trusting Rebecca. And so eventually we have Frank, who is even eating dinner with Rebecca, just trying to find out more things about her. And eventually, at some point while they're in dinner together, we have Rebecca kind of mention that it seems she can sense people who do have a very wild side. And Frank is like, well, who do you think is could be the one that has a wild side in this restaurant here? And Rebecca is like, well, I can't tell you. And he's like, why? And she mentions like, well, because he doesn't know it yet. really pushing Rebecca just be like, well, like, I'm not going to tell you that you are the wild one, and I'm going to push you to that point of eventually being much more wild. So we eventually have Frank, who is to uh, take Rebecca back to her home, and it seems that that Frank is almost going and kissing Rebecca, and Rebecca kind of pushes him away and decides, like, no, like, we shouldn't do this now. To where Rebecca goes on to go into her home, and eventually Frank goes, like, tries to leave, but then he ends up going into Rebecca's home. Eventually, they decide to go into the throes of passion with belts and candle wax and all kinds of things. Um, Rebecca is mentioning that she wants to be in control and ba 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 ba. So we we push on going back into this case. So we are to have Robert, who is to deliver us a guy named Jeffrey Roston. So Jeffrey is a former lover of Rebecca, and so Jeffrey is to come and to tell us that he was a former lover of Rebecca, and he had a heart condition as well, and he was a much older suitor than Rebecca. It seems that Rebecca kind of keys on to finding the same kind of men and to drive them wild. So we have Rebecca, who is to drive this guy to the point of insanity with the way of which that they were to do more than just make love. So we are to push on, and eventually Jeffrey is to mention that he had a bad heart and he ended up getting a triple bypass, and it seems like now he is fine. And so it seems that Jeffrey, who I guess was to not get pushed as far as he could possibly get pushed with Rebecca, uh, we have Jeffrey, who was, I guess, dumped by Rebecca at some point. And it seems that also Jeffrey had left every cent that he owned to Rebecca as well in her will. What a coincidence. So we also have Jeffrey, who is to tell this story about one night that they had of passionate lovemaking, and basically that exact same thing that Jeffrey had told to these people was the exact same thing that both happened to not only Jeffrey but then also to Frank. And so we end up having Frank, who's like, you know what, am I getting played? Like, am I, like, is that just what you do? Like, if anything, maybe I'm not the right kind of guy for you because I'm young. And, like, you can't push me like you've pushed all these other guys. Maybe you did do this. And so we end up having Frank, who is just kind of turned off from Rebecca, and just saying, like, you know what, you are just going to be my client now and nothing more. And so we eventually have Frank, who also has a son and a wife, and so hence affair. And so we eventually have Rebecca, who is to eventually call Frank's wife, and Frank's wife is to get very suspicious that it seems that there is something going on uh, between Frank and his client. So Sharon is to ask Frank if there is something going on between them, because it seems that like, he's been coming home way later than he used to be, and also it seems that he has been more driven in the sack than he ever has with this case. So we have eventually Frank, who is to confess that yes, he did have an affair uh, with this woman, but it was kind of obvious because it seemed that Rebecca had probably told Sharon a number of things, but we're not quite sure. Frank eventually runs to Rebecca and asks her exactly what did she say to Sharon, which again pushes Frank to another angry lovemaking session where he is to cuff uh, Rebecca to this pole and they are to go at it, and Frank is to actually be in control this time around because he is just sick of her games. So we are to further on and go into this case. So we eventually have seemingly that a detective is to eventually showcase to Frank that it seems that there is more to this case than Frank is aware of. That after the footage of both Rebecca and Andrew going at it, it seems like there was another thing that ended up getting recorded over another session that Andrew had had. This session was with Joan. So it seems that Joan and Andrew were a lot closer than we were led to believe. And so we eventually have Frank, who is like, yes, like I can use this even more to my case to drive home the fact that Joan killed Andrew out of jealousy. And so we also have it to where Rebecca also wants to go onto the stand to defend herself, and Frank is like, no, I'm not going to have you F up my case. Like, if anything, the only way that I'll have, like, my own client go up onto the stand is if the case is going horribly and this case isn't. And Frank is telling Rebecca that she is going to F up his case for him, and that like things are going swimmingly for Rebecca to quite possibly get out of this case unscathed. So we go on, and so we are to. I don't know exactly which order this happens, but I don't think it really matters. So we end up having Rebecca to go up onto the stand, and so Rebecca is to tell us that the reason why her and Robert or her and Jeffrey. There we go. The reason why Rebecca and Jeffrey did not work out is because Rebecca found Jeffrey in a bed with another man. It's like, ooh. And so Jeffrey is to leave the court, and because he's right there listening to all of this, and so Jeffrey ends up leaving without actually saying an actual word. But we just kind of assess or assume that maybe Rebecca could be right. And we also have it to where Robert is really asking, like, isn't it a coincidence that you have met, like, Andrew, who had a poor heart condition, and Jeffrey, who had a poor heart condition? And we have Rebecca, who tries to skirt that away by saying, well, this is actually a really small town. Rebecca mentions that she had been with a man that had been with a woman that Robert had been with. That's how small of a town that this is. And Robert's like, oh yeah, I guess. So eventually we are to push on to have Rebecca continue to defend herself, and it seems like she's putting on a good show, and it seems that every question that Rebecca is to have an answer for, and so on and so forth. And so, pushing on. So, we have Frank that brings Joan back to the stand, and this time around, he's basically just straight up accusing her of killing Andrew. Frank is to mention that Joan was actually a lover of Andrew, and Joan could not actually deny that. And so we have it to where also Joan or Frank had mentioned that it seemed that they had found out that the way of which that Andrew had got his cocaine was through some nasal spray. Some nasal spray that Joan had paid for at some grocery store. And so Frank immediately just says, like, well, yeah, you are the one who put this cocaine into Andrew's nasal spray, and you killed him because you were jealous about this whole relationship between Andrew and Rebecca, because you thought that Rebecca was just going to be a passing thing, and eventually Andrew was going to dump her to get back with you. But since that didn't seem to happen anytime soon, that made you all the more reason to try and kill Andrew out of pure jealousy. So, really, with all of this, like, kind of thrown up in there, like, there's so much going on that it seemed like anyone could have actually killed Andrew besides Rebecca. There's a lot of jealous people that all want to go after Andrew, maybe even because of Rebecca and probably jealousy of their relationship and what have you. So we are to get the results of this case. Here was one also scene that we had here at some point. So we have Frank and Rebecca who were to eventually have things going right in the trial at some point. And so they are to share an elevator together. It seems that Rebecca had started to unzip Frank's pants to do a little bit of touching. We have Frank who ends up putting a briefcase over the way to hide what is going on, and eventually they end up going at it in the parking lot. Frank is mentioning that people could probably see them, and so Rebecca ends up breaking the bulb, the light, to where people cannot actually see them, and so there is glass on the hood of this car. We eventually have, within the throes of passion, we end up having Frank, who ends up having being stabbed and having marks all over his back via this glass. So that's why Sharon was so easy to assume that Frank was having an affair, because she was to notice how many scars and cuts that Frank had had on his body. And so that was very obvious that Frank was with someone, to where Frank had to confess to his wife. So we end up getting the verdict, and we end up finding out that Rebecca was not guilty on all charges because there wasn't enough evidence. And plus, it could count to any number of people that could have actually done this. So we end up having Rebecca, who is like, man, like, you were so good, like, that I even was convinced that I wasn't even a person that did this. And Frank kind of got really bothered by that, and really, like, Frank kind of like stewed away and tried to figure out, like, how exactly did Joan buy the air freshener, knowing full well that that was going to lead to Joan putting the cocaine into the smoking gun to lead her to be like a thing of murder. Like, why was there a paper trail that Joan had done this for? Like, was she not thinking? So eventually, Frank is just stewing around with this, trying to figure out what had actually happened. And so we eventually go on to have Frank uh, come back into Rebecca's place, and we find out that it seems that Dr. Alan Paley and Rebecca are there, and they are having a disagreement. And so Frank is to go on now that both Dr. Allen and Rebecca are here. He is to start to realize like what had gone on. We have it to where Rebecca mentions that she is in the clear for Andrew's death because double jeopardy, and but if anything, Alan Paley might not, or Dr. Alan Paley might be not completely in the clear. Maybe he might get a loss of his practice or whatever because of all the things that ended up happening. So, but we go on and we end up having Frank, who is solving the whole mystery of what had gone down. And we have Rebecca, who is like, and we have Dr. Alan Paley, who is like, how is it that he knows all this? Like, how is it that he had figured all of this out? And Rebecca is to just realize it's because he just needed the time to figure this all out to tell us. And so we eventually have Dr. Alan Paley, who is to toss a gun out to go and almost kill Rebecca. We consistently have Paley and Frank fighting over this gun, and we are to eventually have Dr. Paley going over this stair railing, and it seems that Rebecca had gotten shot, but it's kind of just a flesh wound. So Frank was trying to help her and kind of help her up, and we end up seeing the doctor yet again on top of the stairs, gun in hand, to shoot Rebecca into the chest numerous times. She ends up falling out of her home onto the waters, and she is, of course, to die. So, and then we end up having the doctor die as well. So, we end up having Frank, who is, I guess, to make the 911 phone call, and eventually we end up having Robert, who was the other attorney, show up. Like, I guess this is kind of like some, like, district attorney or something like that, where it seems like he's not only involved in, like, police work, but he's also involved in, like, being a lawyer and whatever. So, we end up having Frank, who is to tell Robert, it's like, well, hey, like, if anything, you were actually supposed to win. You were actually supposed to win this case. And Robert is like, well, technically I did win this case because Rebecca is dead. So technically I did win eventually. It just took us a while. So Robert, I guess, could sleep at night knowing that at least like justice was made eventually. And eventually Frank figured out what all had happened. But yeah, so really that's just the way the movie just ends. Like, I didn't want to go into the heavy amount of details of every single thing that happened in this movie. Check it out if you haven't, if you wanted to just hear the details of this movie regardless. But with that said, I think I covered most of this film. There's probably little details here and there that I probably just skipped around about just because I didn't want to have this review be too long. But with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, everybody.